Back in early fall, Kathy and I harvested, well, once they were hauled, about a bushel of walnuts for our winter nut supply. So I husked all the walnut shells off them. They've been fermenting now for about 5 or 6 weeks, and that's going to give me this dark, rich brown color that I'm going to use for my dye today. We are on the cusp of my favorite season of the year, which is winter, and normally where we live in Canada, we normally have snow now. And anyway, I travel for snow. If I have to, I'll go as far north as I have to find it. But while I'm waiting for my dye to heat up, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the shelters that I use. I'm going to be re-dyeing what I figure finally after a lot of years of experimenting, the perfect solo shelter for winter trekking, or any season for that matter. So it's small, and I do that for 2 purposes. It contains more heat, obviously, in the winter, and it's lighter to carry. But for years, all I carried was a tarp, and this poor guy, it's got it's got patches on its patches. And I think I've carried this thing for almost 30 years. And while it may not look like much of a shelter, if you're in the wilderness and you've got to spend a night, you'd think this was a grand possession to have on your kit. So when I can use toboggan and snowshoes, I carry this shelter. If I'm just trekking and I have to carry the bedrolls on my back, I carry a small tarp. Again, with the toboggan, I'll take this guy along. If wind isn't an issue, I'll use it as on top of my boughs that I make for my bed for the night. If it is really windy, I can rig it on the side of the shelter to give me some protection from prevailing winds for the night. So it serves a number of functions. Also pretty handy if you stop to boil up tea. You've got a really small, light tarp that you can put on a snowy log and start a fire and cook up your tea. So you can see this guy, it hasn't been dyed for a long time. It was dyed with walnut. And you can see that's the inside color. And it has faded. I mean, I think it's been probably 6 years since I've dyed this. And then you can see the outside color. So 2 purposes for dyeing. One is its concealment. It's going to give me a nice rich brown natural color that kind of blends into the natural environment. And the other thing is I'm not going to boil it, but I'm going to have it right on the cusp of boiling. And that, with canvas, what that does is it'll tighten that weave up, and it works as waterproofing without adding, like people make oil skins and use linseed oil and pigments and different things, but all that adds weight. And also it causes a bit of a fire hazard. So I'm pretty close to having that ready to dunk this in. So this confusing bit of canvas, like I said, it took me a lot of years of experimenting to come up with this idea. In terms of weight, we're probably talking about 4.5 pounds, maybe 5 pounds in total, which is manageable. Maybe not in your back with a couple of 4-point blankets, but certainly if you've got a toboggan. So I'm just going to spread it out here because I had a few questions as to the dimensions of it. And I see here in my storage some mice got into it, so yet another patch to come. It's worth noting, there's no documentation, obviously, for this particular type of shelter, but I can't help but think they were pretty innovative people. If they had to live out in the wilderness, the hinterland, they would have come up with concepts, I'm sure, that simply weren't documented. So, not trying to justify using something that's non-period, but I'm sure they came up with different ways to shelter themselves from the elements. So what you can see here on this end is a triangle, actually on both ends. I'll just spread it out so you can get a concept of the dimensions. So as I said, I keep it small. So this triangle on this side, this is going to be the peak. So this is only 4 feet. So from here to here, we have 4 feet. It's basically a triangle. This way, the longitudinal angle of the top of the shelter is 6 feet. So 4 feet by 6 feet. The shelter itself that I sleep in is just a hair over 6 feet. Again, it seems short, but I'm under 6 feet tall, so I'm able to tuck into it. It gives me just enough space in the back to put all my kit, keep my musket and my powder dry. And essentially that's it. A couple of things that I added. It used to be just open faced, but I added a second tarp to the front. I use this for smoking jerky, so it's got a little smoke going to it, but we're going to dye that up. It should come out pretty close to the color of the rest of it. So I added that. Now typically, unless it's windy, I'll keep that rolled right up so that it's out of the way. But if it's really windy and during the night the wind picks up, starts to come into the shelter, I can roll that down. I still have access to feed the fire from inside the shelter, and the heat will definitely come through that canvas. But wind is your enemy, weight is your enemy. And as I say, I think I've come up with pretty much the perfect solo shelter. One thing I'm going to change for this winter, because I'm getting ready to go on one, are these canvas ties. They work good in the summer, spring, summer, fall. But in the winter, if they get wet, in the morning when you're trying to undo the knots in them, even if you tie a bow, they're almost impossible to get off. So I'm going to take some, basically, like the laces I use, the wangs I use for laces in my brogans. I'm going to cut pieces of them, use a square knot to tie them into each of these, and have loops like that should, I'll oil them up, and they should come apart much easier when I strike camp in the morning. As they say, that's a really compact piece of canvas, extremely light, and it's been a lifesaver on a couple of occasions when, as I mentioned, wind is your enemy, especially winter camping, and that thing's really served its purpose. So I think my water, or my dye, is about the right temperature. We recently had Denny Caron here, and we did an episode on natural dyes. And he pointed out, I'll point it out again, that we're using a probably 150 or 200-year-old iron pot. This is going to stay permanently set up here, so this is my dyeing station, my soap making station, or whatever else I need a large pot for. But because it's made from iron, we're going to get an even richer brown color, because we're going to get the iron oxide from the pot itself is going to be drawn out of that cast and actually put into the material that I'm going to put in. You can see that really rich brown color. That's perfect. That's fermented just long enough, and actually that's just about the right temperature. It's not, I can actually hold my finger in it. So we don't want to be adding any more wood. We're going to get our shelter in and see what comes out. So while I'm on the topic of winter trekking, historic camping, experiential archaeology, experimental archaeology, whatever you want to call it, you have to go into it with a mindset of, I'm not going to be comfortable, but if I have the right skill sets, I can be the least uncomfortable as possible. And somebody asked me that it must be awfully cold. What was my coldest night? Well, I spent a lot of my youth mountaineering and did a number of expeditions around the world at really high altitudes. But the coldest trip I ever did was to Antarctica in 2000. And I was on an expedition that skied the last degree of the world to the South Pole. Our average temperature was minus 39. Our warmest day was minus 36. And yeah, but the difference between that type of camping and the type of camping that I do in this garb is I had a minus 40 sleeping bag. I had a minus 40 parka. I had these things that looked like moon boots. They were rated at minus 80. We had to have special brackets made up for our skis. We're pulling sledges with more than our body weight, but I was never cold. I did get some frostbite on my skin, but essentially I was warm. My good friend Bob Miller, and he's been here to Kelly Station a number of times, he can back me up on this story, but we did a thing for a Heritage Day in Arden, Ontario, which is in eastern part of our province, halfway between us and our capital. And the temperatures that night went down to minus 41. It was a record. And the winds were so violent that it would actually rip flags. They were just snapping in the wind. We woke up, I shouldn't say woke up because I don't think I slept, but when we got up in the morning and we got a fire going again, Bob made coffee and he poured it into my tin cup. And before I got it to my lips, it was sludge. It was starting to freeze, literally. Probably as close to hypothermic as I've ever been. Anyway, over the years, I have honed my skills at being reasonably comfortable in a winter environment with the clothing, the blankets, the accoutrements that they would have had in the 1700s. Anyway, I think this guy's about cooked. Yeah, he's about done. I can hear a little bit of boil starting, which I don't want. So I'm going to get him out and hang him up for the night to dry. And I've got an old shirt here that I never did like the color. So before I get rid of my dye, I'm going to give it a good dunking as well. Never did like the color of this shirt, and that's about to change.